It's the holiday season. Let's talk about the most prolific mass murderer in Arkansas history. If you don't know who I'm talking about, I am talking about Ronald Gene Simmons. In 1987, in Pope County, Arkansas, Ronald Gene Simmons murdered 16 people over the course of a week. Ronald Gene Simmons actually lived further out west, like in the New Mexico area, for a good portion of his life. In 1979, he retired from the military after 22 years of service. During that time, he served in Vietnam and was actually a decorated Vietnam War veteran. During their life in New Mexico, Ronald and his wife, Becky, had 7 children. Those children in birth order were Ronald Jr., Sheila, William, Loretta, Eddie, Mary Ann, and Rebecca. Now, according to the podcast, The Devil of Pope County, which I highly recommend listening to, at the age of 17, the oldest daughter of the Simmons family actually gave birth to a child that she named Sylvia. Now, according to the podcast, one of the sons found out that the father of Sylvia was actually Ronald Gene Simmons himself. So Sheila had been raped by her own father, and that produced this child, Sylvia. Now, according to that podcast, other people around the Simmons family found the relationship between Ronald Gene Simmons and his daughter Sheila to be off-putting at the very least. And there were reports made to the authorities, including a report made by one of Sheila's own brothers to DHS, that the child that Sheila had given birth to was actually a child that belonged to Ronald Gene Simmons. But unfortunately, DHS didn't really do a whole lot about these claims. Now, eventually, the police were going to get involved. They had interviewed Sheila, and they were going to arrest Ronald Gene Simmons. Well, Ronald Gene Simmons must have had a feeling that he was going to be arrested, because in the middle of the night, he picked his entire family up and fled New Mexico to the state of Arkansas. So they fled New Mexico in 1981. It wasn't until 2 years later, around 1983, that Ronald Gene Simmons actually settled his family in Dover, Arkansas, or outside of Dover, Arkansas, but in Pope County just the same. So he had purchased a 13-acre tract of land, and he essentially put 2 mobile homes together on this land, and that's where his family lived. Something that not enough people realize is that the Ronald Gene Simmons family actually did without a lot. They didn't have indoor plumbing. They didn't have, any kind of air conditioning. His family didn't have indoor plumbing, and his family didn't have air conditioning in the home. But Ronald Gene Simmons felt like he was more important than everybody else, because he actually did have air conditioning in his bedroom. The children weren't allowed to go in his bedroom, and that air conditioning wasn't shared with the rest of the family, but he was scrapping his family out pretty good. These people actually used a literal outhouse to use the bathroom, and Ronald Gene Simmons was sitting up in his room just fine. So because they used an outhouse, the children really didn't think anything about it whenever their father in 1987 started having them dig 3 separate pits on the family's land. When Ronald Gene Simmons left New Mexico, he left his job with the military, which I'm assuming paid decently. He left that job and he moved to Arkansas, where he worked what I would call lower level jobs. He spent a few years working for an oil company, but he was let go from that job because of inappropriate sexual advances. And then he spent some time working at the Sinclair Mini Mart in Russellville. Ronald Gene Simmons quit his job working for Sinclair Mini Mart on December 18th, 1987. On December 22nd, 1987, Ronald Jr. was actually visiting the home of his parents with his daughter, Barbara. Now, his daughter was 2 or 3 years old at the time. So on December 22nd, 1987, Ronald Gene Simmons Sr. beat his wife, Becky Simmons, the mother to his 7 children, with a blunt object and then shot her to death. On that same day, he also shot his son, Ronald Jr., and he strangled Ronald's daughter, Barbara, to death. Those 3 bodies were moved into one of the pits that Ronald Gene Simmons had instructed his children to dig. When Ronald Gene Simmons put these bodies in the pit, he actually put them in there with barbed wire in order to try to keep animals away from the remains. December 22nd, that same day, was actually the last day of school for his school-aged children. So Ronald Gene Simmons actually waited for his children to get off the bus that day. It is believed that Ronald kept the 4 children waiting outside and brought them in the house one at a time, starting with the oldest school-age child, Loretta. After Loretta, Eddie, Mary Ann, and Rebecca followed. Ronald Gene Simmons strangled his children one by one and then dunked them in a rain barrel to make sure that they were no longer alive. So after he had murdered those 4 children, he loaded them in a wheelbarrow and he put them in the same pit that their mother, brother, and niece were put in before. He then put dirt and barbed wire over the top as well as sheet metal. So far, that was 7 family members murdered by Ronald Gene Simmons. Sheila and her family and William and his family were both set to arrive at their parents' home on Mockingbird Hill the day after Christmas, so December 26th, 1987. So between the evening of December 22nd and December 26th, Ronald Gene Simmons just chilled. He just sat back, watched TV, and drank some beer, waiting to murder the rest of his family. On December 26th, Billy, his wife Renata, and their son Trey arrived first. So Ronald Gene Simmons shot Billy and Renata. He then took fishing line like he had everyone else and wrapped it around little Trey's throat and strangled him to death. Ronald Gene Simmons drug Renata and Billy's bodies to the kitchen and covered them with jackets. He then put Trey's body in the trunk of a car. Then Sheila arrived with her husband Dennis and their children Sylvia and Michael. Now you have to remember, Ronald Gene Simmons was in love with Sheila and Sylvia was his daughter. Ronald Gene Simmons shot Sheila and Dennis. He then wrapped that fishing line around Sylvia's neck and around Michael's neck. He put Michael in the trunk of a car, but Sylvia, he actually put under a blanket on a bed in the bedroom. All of Ronald Gene Simmons' family members had now been murdered by him, but he wasn't done yet. After finishing off his family, Ronald Gene Simmons actually went to Russellville to run some errands. He went to a bar, had a few drinks, and then he went back home and spent the weekend at home with the bodies of his family members. On December 28th, Ronald Gene Simmons actually drove back to Russellville and he went to a law firm where he shot the receptionist, Kathy Kendrick. Kathy Kendrick was actually the woman that he had made inappropriate advances to that ended with him getting fired from his job at the oil company. He then went to the oil company where he shot J.D. Chaffin, and he also shot the owner of Sinclair Mini Mart, Rusty Taylor. He next went to the Mini Mart where he shot 2 people, Roberta Woolry and David Sawyer. After that, Ronald Gene Simmons went to Woodline Motor Freight and shot one last person. He shot his former supervisor, Joyce Butts. After he was done with his murder spree, he actually just sat down and waited for police to arrive. And at this point, police were running all over Russellville trying to figure out what the heck was going on with all of these shootings that were suddenly happening. It wasn't until after they got Ronald Gene Simmons in custody that they decided to take a trip to Mockingbird Hill, where they made the gruesome discovery slowly but surely and found all of the bodies. I think if Ronald Gene Simmons could have pled guilty to all of the murder charges and got the death penalty, he would have done that because Ronald Gene Simmons actually wanted to be put to death. And with the death penalty, there's so much said, like some people say it's justice, some people say it's the easy way out and life in prison would be justice. But in this case, Ronald Gene Simmons actually wanted the death penalty, and so many people felt like that was his just deserving. So Ronald Gene Simmons had 2 trials for the 16 murders. He was found guilty of all of the murders, and he was sentenced to the death penalty. At that time, in the state of Arkansas, there were no mandatory appeals for the death penalty, but other people filed appeals on Ronald's behalf. Ronald himself didn't file any appeals because he wanted to be put to death. On June 25th, 1990, Ronald Gene Simmons actually got his wish. He was put to death by lethal injection. I believe that Ronald Gene Simmons was Arkansas's first lethal injection, and he had a choice. That's what he chose. That wasn't Pope County's only family massacre, though.